Archdiocese Today is made possible by Ratterman Family Funeral Homes.
Somebody once said that life happens while you're making plans to do something else. And I never, when I was in school or even as a young teacher, planned to become an expert on sacraments. But I got my first college teaching job after I had worked in a Catholic parish. I had also done some high school teaching. And of course, when you're in that kind of position, you're doing First Communion preparation and First Penance preparation, Confirmation preparation. This was way back in the last century, before we had RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults. So we really didn't do baptism preparation, and of course marriage preparation was done out of the rectory and so on. And ordination preparation was done in seminaries, but I still had some background. So when I got my first college teaching job, which was in Sioux City, Iowa, they said, what courses would you like to teach? And I said, well, what courses are there that you need taught? And they said, well, we'd like somebody to teach the sacraments course, and since you've had some background in sacraments, why don't you teach that? And so I went immediately to the library to look for the book that had been written on the history of sacraments, because this was shortly after the Second Vatican Council, and the changes were coming in the liturgy, changes were coming in the other sacraments, and people were saying, well, how come we can change? They haven't changed for centuries. How come Catholics can change the sacraments? And one of the things that was done for Catholics in those days was to show them that over the centuries, for about 15, 16 centuries, sacraments had actually evolved and changed. And it was only in the last 400 years or so that we had the sacraments in that set format in Latin that really didn't change very much. So, and there's even a video program out, right? I think you can still get it today. It's called The Changing Sacraments. Back in those days, we had it on film strips. How many of you can remember film strips? Okay, there you go. And there are other, I think one of the programs here talks about sacraments here. It's a new one that I hadn't seen, but each one of us is like baptism past and present, confirmation past and present. So it's, even today, all of that historical research that had been done earlier in the 20th century, mostly in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And so by the time of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the church historians and other experts could tell the bishops, well, you know, things had changed in the past, and if Pope John wants a little bit of an updating, that's why he said he called the council, we can do that by going back to earlier forms of the sacraments. We don't have to always have the medieval forms in Latin. And that was really the basis. So I knew that all this historical research had been done, and so I went to the library to look for that book that had been written on the history of sacraments, and it wasn't there. So he said, well, this is a small school. It's way out there in the middle of the Midwest, Sioux City, Iowa, and perhaps nobody bothered to buy it for the library. So I looked in this reference work called Books in Print, which lists all of the books that are currently in print in the United States. And it wasn't there either. And I said, darn it, not only didn't they buy it, but it's out of print already. So I called down to Creighton University, which is about 50 miles away, a large Catholic university in Omaha. And they have a theology department that's so large that they have one person who just deals exclusively in sacramental theology. And I asked him, well, what's the name of the book? And he says, you know, nobody's really taken all of that historical research and put it all together in the covers of a single book. So I taught the course without a book, and all the students on their student evaluation said this course needs a book. And I was lucky because there I was in Sioux City, and there's not too much to do at night in Sioux City, Iowa. And my kids were still young, and I could put them to bed at 8, and from 8 o'clock until 2 o'clock in the morning, I'd do my research and do my writing. And so the book that came out of it was called Doors to the Sacred. This is actually the second edition of the book. The third edition is over here. The first edition came out in 1981, and every 10 years we've come up with a kind of an updating of that book, updating the bibliographies and also reviewing what's happened in the last 10 years. So like between the first and second edition, the RCIA did come out. And also the permanent diaconate program became much more active. So those kinds of things were included in the second edition. Between the second and third edition, the Catechism came out, the 1994 Catechism. So I included what kinds of things are in the Catechism that were included in the earlier versions of the book. And I'm getting ready for another one that'll come out hopefully in 2011. I also did a second book, a kind of follow-up book. This one's called The Catholic Sacraments. It was published by Michael Glazier, which is now a part of Liturgical Press, and they're going to be coming out with a new edition of that, maybe next year. And then, most recently, I did this high school textbook on sacraments, which was also used in some places in parishes for adult education, because it was actually originally written to be a book to be used in parishes with adults for various reasons. The main one is that the publisher went out of business. The publisher that was going to publish, so it sat in my file for about 10 years, and then somebody Harcourt called me up and said, "We're looking for a high school textbook." And I said, "I don't really have time to write something, but here's this old book that I wrote." And they said, "Well, we can use that as the basis." So it was actually written for adults, but it's kind of put in study questions and pictures and glossary with definitions and so on. So there are a number of Catholic high schools that find that to be very helpful. So somehow or other, even though I didn't plan it, most of my theological life has revolved around sacraments, what they are, what they mean, their history, and so on. So this is just a little bit about myself. Even though I'm no longer teaching full-time, I do get a chance to teach in summers, and this past summer I taught at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, which you may or may not know is a large center for liturgy in the United States, and was one of the centers for the liturgical renewal that led up to the Second Vatican Council. So I enjoyed doing that summer teaching, and I also enjoy getting out to parishes or to programs such as this. So we're going to talk about sacraments this morning, and some of you may be old enough to remember the old Baltimore definition of Baltimore Catechism definition of a sacrament. Does anybody remember that? What that was? Oh, look at that. Too many young folks here. Too many young folks here. Well, the definition was a sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. A sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. And at the time of the Second Vatican Council, it began to appear that there were some shortcomings with that definition. For one thing, Catholics insisted that there are only 7 sacraments, only 7 sacraments. Other Protestant churches may have a different number of sacraments, but there are 7 sacraments and only 7 sacraments according to the Catholic Church. But then the bishops went ahead and said, the church is a sacrament. Well, the church is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace, so that kind of fits the definition of a sacrament. But now, well, wait a minute, we said there were only 7 sacraments, but now you're saying that there are 8, and also theologians began to say, well, in a certain way, Christ is a sacrament of God. Christ is God made visible in human form. You couldn't say that Christ was it. It doesn't fit the old definition, but here go the bishops, and they're messing around. They're saying that Christ is a sacrament, and he doesn't even fit the definition. So for a number of reasons, that traditional definition became not as useful, not as helpful as it used to be. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a definition of sacraments that we can work with. And I call it a working definition. It's a working definition of sacraments. And I'm not going to claim that it's the best definition. I'm not going to say that it's the only definition. I'm not going to say that it's the be-all and end-all definition, and that there will never be a better definition. But I call it a working definition because we're going to work with it. We're going to kind of take it apart. And through taking it apart and looking at its various elements, we'll come up with, hopefully, a better understanding of what sacraments are and how they work. And the definition is this. Sacraments are 7 church rituals or ceremonies. 7 church rituals or ceremonies that celebrate and help us to connect with. That celebrate and help us to connect with the most important realities in the Christian life. The most important realities in the Christian life. So once again, sacraments are 7 church rituals or ceremonies that celebrate and help us to connect with the most important realities in the Christian life. So right away it starts off with the number 7. Because we were saying, well, we're not going to get into that argument of how many sacraments there are. In our definition, in our church, there are 7. We're going to be very practical about it. I don't know if some of you may come from a Protestant background or have other members of your family that are Protestant, but the Protestant churches, how many sacraments do they have? 2. Okay, and what are they? Baptism, yes. They have marriage, but they don't call it a sacrament. But the churches that have 2, baptism is certainly one of them. And the other one is what we call Eucharist. They may call it Eucharist, or they may call it Holy Communion, or they may call it the Lord's Supper. So those are the 2 that most Protestant churches have. Some churches do have 7, like the Episcopalians in the United States, also the Anglicans in England. It's the same church, different names. And they have 7, but they distinguish between the 2 primary, baptism and Eucharist, and then the other 5. And then there are still other churches. I think Lutherans include confirmation that have a little bit higher number. And other churches like Baptists. Baptists have baptism and communion, but they don't call them sacraments. They call them ordinances. They call them ordinances. Why do they call them that? Is because these are the 2 sacraments, or these are the 2 church rituals, let's say. These are the 2 church rituals that were ordered by Christ. So there's in the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus, just before his ascension, says to the people who are gathered around, "Go therefore into the whole world, teaching them whatsoever I have commanded you, and baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." Sounds like a command. Sounds like an order. Okay. And then at the end of the Last Supper, after Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," what does Jesus say there too? We still say it at Mass. He says, "Take this bread and do this in memory of me." Okay, sounds like an order. Okay, so the Baptists have these 2, but they don't call them sacraments. Okay, so to avoid all that kind of confusion, we're going to say right off that in the Catholic Church, the sacraments are 7 church rituals or ceremonies. Do we have any other church ceremonies besides these 7? Sure we do. What would be some of them? Blessings. Think of Holy Week. What are some of the things we do at Holy Week? Okay, veneration of the cross. We have stations of the cross. You can say the rosary, right? We've got novenas, various kinds of devotions. Now, kind of a generic name for this, it's not as widely used in the Catholic Church today, but it was very common in my day. It's a word that sounds like sacrament, but it's not sacrament. What's that word? Sacramental. So sacramental simply means like a sacrament, or sacrament-like. Okay. The word sacrament itself has the word sacred in it, sacra. It's the Latin word for sacred. So a sacrament, you might say a simple definition of a sacrament, it's a sign of something sacred, or even more simply, it's a sacred sign. So there are other signs of sacred realities or other sacred signs, rituals in the Catholic Church that we don't designate as sacraments, but kind of the general word for them is sacrament-like or sacramentals. Now, these other churches that have only 2 sacraments, let's say, you mentioned that they have weddings, that people get married in those churches, so they have church ceremonies such as ours, they just don't call them sacraments. In a lot of Protestant churches, ministers are ordained. So they have an ordination ritual, but they don't call it a sacrament. Okay? So what our tradition is, in our Catholic tradition, is we have these 7 that we have called sacraments. And so just to be practical, in our practical definition here, we're saying that these are our 7 sacraments, and these are the ones that we're going to try to understand. We say that they celebrate, and by saying that they celebrate, we don't mean that we're doing this with balloons and fireworks and all kinds of other kinds of celebrations like that, but it's that they signify or they point to or they refer to. What do they refer to? They help the most important realities in the Christian life, and these are spiritual realities. Sometimes these are called Christian mysteries, or sometimes they're called God's gifts, or sometimes there's an older theological term called grace. And they also help us to connect with those realities. That is to say, they help us to experience or to feel more intensely what those realities are, and in doing that, to understand them a little bit more deeply. Now, the key element in all of this is the word symbol. Symbol. And by symbol, we don't mean what you have in the orchestra, where 2 people strike them together and they come up with a symbol. This is S-Y-M-B-O-L. It's what the older Catechism called a sign. Sacraments are outward signs instituted by Christ. The Latin word in the Middle Ages didn't have the word symbol the way that we use it today. And so what we need to understand, and this is what we'll be doing in the first part of the presentation today, we'll be understanding better what symbols are and how they work. What they are and how they work. So let me see, you've been together for how long? How long has, what's the oldest, I shouldn't say the oldest person in the group. I understand that in this program you can kind of come in at any time and finish, about a year or 2 after you get started. So who's the person who's been in the program the longest? Who has been in this program the longest?
I started last August.
Okay, about August or so on. Okay, so all of you are newer than that. Is there anybody here who knows everybody else? Good. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to when I give you the word, stand up and find somebody that you don't know, or if you know at least the other folks on a first name, find somebody that you don't know very well, but preferably somebody that you don't know or you hardly know. And take 2 chairs and put them anywhere in the room and sit down so you're facing each other really, really close, because I'm going to have you talk to each other about your own experiences, and I don't want you to be so far away that you're going to have to be talking loud and interfering with what other people are saying. Okay, got that? And we got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We have 12 people here, so that's an even number that's going to make it very easy. Okay, so if you would stand up and find another. You can leave all your. You're not going to need notes. You're not going to take notes in this part. So find yourself a buddy. No, put that down, because you're not going to have a chance. You're just going to be talking for the next half hour or so. And find somebody else and find a chair to sit down with and face that other person. The next thing, a very tough question, is, well, you can introduce yourself. Say, my name is so on, and maybe what parish you're in or something else like that. You just have to be talking to her. You're supposed to be talking to her.
Yeah.
Okay, introduce yourself to her. Now I want you to find out whose birthday is closest to January 1st in either direction. So you may be a January baby or a December baby or a February baby or a November baby. And when you find that out, I want the person whose birthday is closest to January 1st to raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Are you both pretty? Yesterday we had two people that had exactly the same birthday, which is the first time that ever happened to me. So you're okay. So you're the closer. So you have two birthdays that are pretty close. Okay, the person whose birthday is closer to January 1st, raise your hand. Okay, you are the starter. So I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to ask you to talk about your own experience. So I'm not going to ask you anything that you don't know. But the rule is that the starter gets a chance to go first. And when the starter is talking, the partner keeps silent. You don't jump in there and say, oh, that reminds me, or something like that. Okay? So the partner just listens. Then after about a minute or so, I will let the people change places. And I'll say, okay, now let the partners talk. And when the partner talks, then the starter keeps quiet and then just listens. And then after that, we'll do a little bit of finding out from various people who want to share what it is that they talked about. Okay? So here's the first question. I want you to think of something that happened in your life that you would be willing to call a religious experience or a spiritual experience. A religious experience or a spiritual experience. It doesn't necessarily have to do with church. I'm not going to define it any more than that. But something that you would be willing to call a religious experience or a spiritual experience. And if it's something that was just so intense and personal that you wouldn't want to share it with anyone, don't use that one. Pick a different one. Okay? Pick a different one and just talk about that for a minute or so with your partner. Okay? So I'll give you a few seconds to think. And when you're ready, let the starter begin. Okay, let's find out what kinds of experiences might be out there. Would there be a few people who would be willing to, and you don't have to spend a minute doing it, but maybe just kind of name the kind of experience that you were describing to your partner. In just a few words.
It was an ordinary Sunday.
An ordinary Sunday, uh-huh.
And I was going to communion like I'd done many times, and it was really an epiphany. It was when the priest placed the host around, it was like I felt such an overwhelming presence of God. I felt like he was giving me a big hug, and it was neat.
Okay, so there's a spiritual experience, a religious experience that's actually connected with church. And I was suggesting that these kinds of experiences can happen outside of. Who has one that happened?
It really was the most spiritual.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you.
I've ever had.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Another one, maybe outside of church. Yes.
My father had a massive stroke, and it was, although it didn't kill him immediately, he was in the hospital and took care of him, and laid there for a few days. And I just, on the last day, I was sitting there watching him, and he'd been struggling with breathing for days, and then all of a sudden it was like he kind of got quiet, and then I could just see him let go, and that was powerful.
So you were there when he died?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Another one.
Well, I shared my experience about one day I was picking my sister and my son up to go to Kmart, which she lived on the north side of Broadway, and I had to go home from Bell South, pick her up, get her, we were rushing, and get her out Biggs Highway before they closed, and we were hit by an EMS truck. I thought, just from the impact that we were all dead. But I was pinned in the passenger side of the car, and I remember lying on my back, and I saw two people praying for us, and no one. When it was all over, I went to the hospital overnight, but when it was all over, said and done, no one had a scratch, but the car was totaled.
Wow.
So I was saying that I feel that even at our death, even for a few seconds, he gives us a choice. of whether we're ready to go or not. You hear people say, you better be ready and woo, 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 but I believe, from my experience with that he gives you, even if it's a brief second, to know that you're going.
So it's really an encounter with death and a little bit of a miraculous survival and what you learned in that experience and from that experience. Let's get one more. Yes?
Well, I had heart surgery, and my daughter asked for a priest. So he came in and he was giving me, I called it last rites. It's called a healing, I think.
Anointing of the sick, yeah.
Well, I remember laying there saying, ooh, I must really be sick. Because I wasn't aware that I was that sick. When I woke up later, 2 or 3 days later, I realized what that was. And my life hasn't been the same. Ever. It just changed.
Okay, so it really had an effect on you. Yeah. Okay, thank you for sharing those.
Hi, Barbara. How are you today?
Hi, Jim.
Good.
So nice to be able to bring our audience here to see Jim Ratterman at Ratterman Son Funeral Home on Bardstown Road.
In the chapel here, we have seating for about 125 to 130 people. And expansion at the backside where we can add additional folding chairs for an additional 100 people. We're just tickled with it.
Jim, thanks for the coffee. It makes me feel very much at home, just like this lounge does.
Great. Well, that's the whole purpose of the lounge. We're just really happy with the way it turned out. We've just, as I said earlier, we've doubled the size of the lounge. The kitchen area is quite a bit larger and has a large counter space and sink and, of course, coffee and soft drinks and refrigerator to take care of the families. And they share that room together, but each of them have a separate table for themselves and a separate cove with a separate sideboard so that when their family or their friends or their church bring in food, they can put it on their side and not have to worry about it being disturbed by anyone else. We've tried decorating the lounge as best we can and make it as much like your family home as possible. So there's a lot of family pictures on the walls. The whole idea behind creating the parlor is to try to develop a living room setting so that when people come in to visit a friend who had died, they have an opportunity to share their feelings and memories of the person that was such a good friend, or that was their uncle or their aunt, or there was somebody from church that they knew very well, and they need a private place to sit and talk, and that's what the room is all about. We've also tried to make it a little bit larger too for the flower, to accommodate the flowers that are sent and the special mementos that are put out, be it pictures or a golf club or a baseball glove or a fishing pole or a blanket that was knitted or crocheted. The room works very well.
I want to thank you for inviting us to your home. It's beautiful.
Well, Barbara, it's been wonderful having you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ratterman Family Funeral Homes, serving Louisville families for over 130 years.
And that kind of leads into what we're going to be talking about next. You're kind of anticipating where we're going, which has to do with signs of things that are sacred. But that in itself was a religious experience.
Okay, this was about a friendship that recently developed. We've known each other for now about 2 years, and what makes us so special is that when we first started, when we first got acquainted, I occasionally, every now and then, like friends do, you'd have dinner at her house, she'd have dinner at mine. But the relationship with her and the whole family, she's got 3 kids, one outside home. At home she has 2 kids and a husband, and it's just me and my mom in my house. And over the months, the relationship between all of us has really gotten tighter and tighter because they fell onto some really hard times. And so we've taken on the task of providing, especially supper, for them. And then in return, there's a lot of times I'll go down there and do stuff with her or for her, and there is developed out of that a really close, special bond that has definitely had an influence on the way, because it's very hard for me to trust people, because I've had a lot of bad experiences. This has been so positive and so such a blessing for me. It is really, I really understand what it means to have a true friend.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you also are kind of going in the direction that we're going to go, and you're talking, here I am asking you for experiences, and you're already talking to me about the meaning of the experiences, which is where we're going to go next. But that's fine. That's fine. We had a couple more. Do we have, let's say, one from over there and one from over here?
Well, he won't talk in public.
So you're going to tell his experience for him?
No, he didn't finish it.
Oh, we didn't finish.
All my stories are long.
Okay. But could you just kind of name one of the experiences that either yours or his?
I have a special needs child, and when he was a little baby, he was very, very sick. And the doctors wanted to take all his IVs out and just let him starve to death. Just, And I said, no. God gave him and God will take him. You don't have that power. So I was at home that evening and talking with my husband, and he didn't want a vegetable. I don't want a vegetable. I don't want to watch a vegetable grow. And I said, God gave him to me, and now I'm asking that he give me a chance to raise him. And after I said that, it was like the weight of the world just lifted off of my shoulders. And that child is 36 years old and a menace, healthier than most grown men.
Okay.
And that's pray for him.
Yeah. Okay. So it's certainly the life-changing experience. And over here, you guys were kind of. Oh, you already went to. Is there a group? Did we? Oh, maybe we didn't hear from this couple this time. Okay.
I shared when I was in high school going on a retreat. I went to public school and going on a retreat in my sophomore year, and how that truly meant something.
Okay, so retreat experience in which something special happened, something that we learned that we didn't know as we were going into that. What I want you to do is maybe dig a little bit deeper into that experience, or maybe one of the ones that wasn't mentioned here yet, or one of the ones that you talked about earlier. And I'd like you to think of what is it that that experience put you in touch with. What was the kind of the underlying reality, if you want to call it, or the overarching reality that you came in contact with. You're already starting to talk about this, because what I asked you for were just some experiences, and you're already telling me what it meant to you. And so we want to focus now on that part here. And let me start off with you, because you did me a favor by not getting into that part. and talk a little bit, what name at least one of the things that you found there that touched you in that retreat experience that kind of became real for you at that time.
Well, I was very shy in school, and I was very uncomfortable around my peers. Unless I had a special relationship, I just was uncomfortable. I feel like that gave me a start, because right after that I just made up my mind that I did not have to hide myself, be who I needed to be or wanted to be.
Okay, so you
waited until I got to college, because these people already knew who I was. I wanted to
so you had to be in a
and I was able to come out of my shell a bit.
Okay, so it kind of gave you a new sense of yourself.
Yes.
Okay, gave you that. And you were talking about the time when you were in grade school, Catholic grade school, and you had said it gave you all kinds of values and other kinds of things. What were they?
I think it shaped my my view on not just education and religion, and that was a huge part of our education, but also respect.
Okay.
We treated not just the teachers with respect, but everybody with respect.
You were talking about discipline, doing your homework, responsibility.
Yes. If you didn't do something you were supposed to, there were penalties. But yeah, definitely that there was always cause and effect. And it was always carried over into the home, but even in school, you're expected to maintain a certain level of behavior.
So it's beliefs, values, ideals, all these kinds of things that you picked up in Catholic school. Okay, some of the others then. And in talking about your son.
Just that if you ask with a pure heart, knowing that he will do it, he will.
So trusting in God and prayer and the value of prayer.
You know, God gave him God was going to take him away. So, yeah, I just remember the weightlifting.
Okay, so there was a physical sensation connected with that.
Yeah, it was like, oh, and I shared that with my husband. You know, the weight is just that. And he said, well, that's good for you.
So, so it was like putting everything in God's hands so you didn't have to carry that burden anymore. So again, it's you had an experience of being able to trust in God completely. Okay. And over here, either the person who spoke or somebody else. Doesn't have to be the person who spoke last time.
I think I learned that I need to keep planting the seeds of faith. And the dove is the sign, you know, to take time, even when I don't have time.
So you had a sense that was giving a kind of approval to something that you did, something that was risky, something you didn't know what even the right thing to do was. You had a neighbor who was in need, and you're saying, oh, let me see, I used to watch those old movies, and they would take the crucifix and the holy water and sprinkle it around. And okay, and that somehow, I have no idea kind of what it was that you were dealing with, but you know very well internally what it was that you were experiencing, and that's what we're talking about today. And for this person here in front, you were talking about friendship, and even though, well, you talked really more about the experience of friendship, but that happened over some real experiences. You met her, or she met you, and then you had dinner at each other's house, and then that family experienced a need, and you helped to meet that need. And through those experiences, you discovered something else happening that maybe you didn't anticipate in the past. Okay, are there any others out there, either people who had a chance to speak or people who didn't before? Yeah, okay.
I think in my experience of helping or doing the program with nuns, I guess at that age, I never thought that I could impact someone that was Christ-like. And seeing the fact that, I think it's made me want to be more Christ-like. I think when you're in elementary school, you have respect, but nothing impacts a priest or a nun, but it does.
Yeah, you think it's all one way, and you saw that you could really have an impact on other people's lives too. Okay, so we have those experiences as well as the ones that were shared earlier. And one of the reasons for doing this little exercise is to realize that each of your experiences is unique. Each of your experiences is your own. And nobody had exactly the same experience, although you may have had similar experience. Somebody may have described an experience, oh, that reminds me, yeah, I had an experience a little bit like that. But in a very real sense, all of those experiences are particular, they're concrete, they're individual, they are unique. They're unrepeatable. But when we went to the second question and I asked you, well, what did you experience, or what did you learn, or what was the impact that it had on you, or what was kind of the spiritual reality that you became aware of in and through that experience, people talked about things that were kind of more general, more universal, things that other people could relate to. So again, even if you didn't have that other person's experience, well, I learned that, but I learned it in a different situation. So these second kinds of things that we talked about, they are just as real as the first kinds of things that we talked about, experiences that we have every day. But these things like values, principles, beliefs, ideals, things like friendship, honesty, courage, your sense of self-worth, and so on, all of these things are real, but they're not physical, They're not material. And so they really are what we can call spiritual realities, spiritual realities. And these spiritual realities, as a matter of fact, are much more important for us as human beings than physical realities. So you can be in a family, for example, and maybe you don't have a lot of material stuff. But if you have a close-knit family, if you have mom and dad really working for the good of the kids, and the kids trying to help out and doing what they can contribute to the well-being of the family, they can really have a sense of family and a kind of joy in that family life, and learning things like responsibility and realizing that they can make a contribution to the family and so on, all of which are spiritual. So even though that family doesn't have a whole lot of stuff, they're very rich in these spiritual realities. And conversely, and this very often happens when people have a whole lot of material stuff, every kid is in his own room watching his own TV or listening to his own stereo or something like that, and they don't have a whole lot to do with one another as family. And so that reality as family really begins to get lost with all of the material, physical stuff that's going on. But for us as human beings, it's these spiritual realities that are much, much more important, much, much more significant to us. So much so that if we don't have them, our life doesn't really seem human, doesn't really seem worth living. There was Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, when I was a kid growing up, had a TV show, half hour every week. I think it was on Tuesday evenings, called Life is Worth Living. And you can still get black and white reruns of this on videotape, or maybe even DVD now. But part of the understanding behind the title of that program is that it's the spiritual things in life that make our lives worth living, and not so much the material things in life. And these are really real, even though ordinarily when we think of reality, we think of something that is seeable, hearable, touchable, feelable, or smellable. In other words, something hard, concrete. But in terms of our human lives, in terms of our spiritual lives, it's the spiritual realities that are much, much more important. Even you and I mean, I'm talking here, physically, what's happening is you're getting sound waves hitting on your eardrums, which then get translated into electrical impulses that go into your brain. So you're not physically hearing any ideas. But hopefully you're getting ideas. But ideas are spiritual realities. So somebody can do an X-ray or a CAT scan of your brain. They can see something like brain activity, but nobody can see your ideas. Okay? We just talked about experiences and memories. Again, we can find brain traces, brain activity, neurotransmitters, and all these kinds of things in your head, but nobody can find your memories. And that's one of the reasons why they're precious, is because they are spiritual realities. Is that beginning to make sense? Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do one more thing, and that is to think of something in your life, something that you have maybe in your possession now, or something that you encounter from time to time, something that is seeable, hearable, touchable, feelable, or smellable. So it could be a photograph, it could be a souvenir, it could be a song, it could be a melody, it could be a smell. It could be a statue or a knick-knack or some other kind of memorabilia, but something that either you have in your possession or maybe that you hear or encounter, like a song or a smell from time to time, that reminds you of some event or person or something in the past that still is important for you. So think of something like a souvenir or a photograph or a song or something like this, that when you see it, or when you encounter it in some way, it puts you in touch with something else that is significant for you. And let me start off this part by talking a little bit about something for myself. I mentioned earlier that being in the Boy Scouts was very important for me, since I grew up in New York City, so I'm not from these parts. And my mother thought it was very important for me to get out the concrete canyons and to see what grass looked like and what trees looked like. So every year she sent me to scout camp for 4 weeks, actually. And so I did that, and then after I became old enough to work on the staff, I worked on the staffs there, and I was on Scouts camp staffs for about 5 years before finally getting so wrapped up in college work that I didn't do that anymore. But it was very important for me as a young man growing up. In my family, my parents were separated, so I didn't have a dad at home, and this gave me an experience out of doors, whereas in the city and in the country, whereas not in that environment. And it also gave me a chance to be with young men and older men who could be role models for me, and like yourself, kind of being on that retreat or maybe being a little bit in Catholic school, had a chance to develop skills and get a sense of self-worth, things that I could do that I didn't know that I could do. And all of that became very, very important to me. And I still have in my basement an old suitcase filled with Boy Scout stuff. And every now and then I have to go down to that. It has old camping gear, and every now and then if we're going to go camping, I'll go down and get a canteen or get something else that I need. But in that is my old merit badge sash. You know, the Boy Scouts work on merit badges and all my medals. And Boy Scouts are into patches, so I have camp patches and so on. And neckerchief slides, some of which I made, and lanyards. Everybody likes lanyards in camp. So I opened that up, and it's almost like being there. It kind of brings me back across decades to kind of the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences of not only being in camp, but also being in Scouts, and the things that I learned from being in Scouts, including being trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. All the things that are part of the Scout law. So all of those are, you might say, values that suitcase full of Scout paraphernalia represents to me and puts me in contact with. Now, all of those things, we can call them souvenirs, we can call them memorabilia or whatever, but the Greek word for that is symbolon, which is where we get the word symbol. And a symbolon was actually a piece of pottery that would be broken in half in such a way that the two parts would fit together only with one another. And so, for example, if you've ever had a cup or a plate that you didn't want to throw away after it broke and you wanted to put it together, one of the things you discover is that there's really only one right way for those parts to fit together. And when they do fit together properly, they fit together so closely that all you can see is a little like hairline crack. So there's really only one way that those two pieces can be put together. Symbalein, which is the verb form of this, means to throw together or to put together. It's where we get the word ball from, like as in throwing a ball. And sim is a prefix which means together, as in word symphony, which means to play together or to sound together. So a symbolon was an item that could be broken apart and put back together, and it served a number of different purposes. This is even in prehistoric Greece. So this is before the invention of writing. And so when, let's say, two rulers would make a treaty, they would agree. I don't know if they shook hands or whatever they did in those days, but then they would take one of these, break it in half, and each would take half of it to his or her own kingdom or whatever region that was called. And when one would send a message to the other, the messenger would carry half of the symbolon. And so the receiver would put it together with the half that they had, and they would know that the message was authentic. So it put that together, and that would authenticate the message. Another way that this was used was in a time of danger. Either maybe there was a terrific storm or a flood coming or a time of war. A person, there are some stories, for example, of parents taking one of these and either sewing it into their child's clothing or tying it around their neck, putting a little hole in it or something like that, so that if after the storm or after the war, if they could get their child back, find the child, they would have the other half and show that this was their child. So a symbolon, or a symbol, it puts two things together. And that's what something like a souvenir or a piece of memorabilia, something that we've just been talking about, does. On the one side is you. On the other side is the spiritual reality that the symbol represents to you. And what the symbol does, it helps you to connect with that spiritual reality. It reminds you of that. And as I said earlier, these spiritual realities are very, very important in our lives as human beings, and of course then also in our lives as Christians and as Catholics. And this is why symbols, and as we'll see in the second part of the program, symbolic rituals are so important, because they help us to reconnect with these spiritual realities. And these are actually found in all religions. And again, I like to look at the meanings of words and the etymology or the roots of words. In the word religion is the root lig, L-I-G. And that word means to connect, or a connection, or to unite. Are there any other English words that have that L-I-G root, meaning to connect, or a connection that you can think of? A part of your body, something you learned in high school biology. A ligament. A ligament is a thing that connects muscle to bone. Okay, so that's another word that has that root in it. And this Latin prefix, re, means what? Again. It means to do again. So you redo, you retry, you rewrite. And that means doing it again. So religion, etymologically, the root meaning of the word is to reconnect. And as human beings, we not only have a need to connect with the kinds of spiritual realities we've just been talking about, but we also have a need to reconnect with them. And this is why all religions at all times, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, whatever religion is around the world, one of the things they do is they help people to connect with these important spiritual values, beliefs, ideals that help to make their lives truly human and truly worthwhile. And so religion does that by helping them and helping us to reconnect with these spiritual realities. A name for these kinds of spiritual realities is a mystery. Ask any Catholic to name a mystery, and very often they'll say, well, the Trinity. I don't understand it at all. But a mystery cannot be something that you don't understand at all. Because if that were true, you wouldn't even know that it's a mystery. Okay. So a mystery has to be something that you do understand a little bit. But I'm going to take it a step further, and I'm going to say a mystery is something that you experience but do not understand fully. It's something that you experience and that you know experientially, but that you do not fully understand. So you understand a little bit about it. And so again, the kinds of things that we've been talking about, family, friendship, respect, trust, the kinds of things that you learned in school, your sense of self, and your own faith and what you learned about it through reading the confessions and so on. All of these things are spiritual realities, and these reminders help us to reconnect with that. And you understand something of that spiritual reality that you're thinking about, but you don't understand it fully. And sometimes we go through life, and every now and then we have another deeper understanding or a deeper appreciation for that spiritual reality. So things like fidelity, trust, confidence, love, hope, forgiveness, all of these things are spiritual realities that our religion helps us to connect with. You could call these mysteries of goodness or good mysteries. And in that sense, we can also refer to them as blessings or graces or God's gifts. We realize that we don't, if you didn't have it before, you realize in a sense it's a gift that you got this. Now there are also negative mysteries. there are, you might say, mysteries of evil or bad mysteries. And so, for example, a person who is training for the Olympics and all of a sudden gets run over by a Mack truck and they're paralyzed from the waist down. Say, my God, why did this happen to me? So that person is experiencing something that is negative, that's not wanted, not desirable. They certainly are experiencing it, but they don't fully understand it. Okay. A mystery is not a problem. For most people, the Trinity is a problem, but it's not a mystery. That is to say, they've heard the word Trinity, they've heard homilies and theology teachers say that in God there's one God and three persons. I don't understand that. Well, it's really a head thing for them. They've never experienced the Trinity, at least not in any way that they know of. And so it's really just a problem. But a mystery would be something like what our friend over here said when she experienced Christ's presence after receiving communion. It's something that was real. It's something that happened to her. She knows that it happened, but she doesn't fully understand it. And in that sense, it was a genuine experience of mystery. It's been sometimes said that a problem is something that we have, and a mystery is something that has us. A problem is something that we have, and a mystery is something that has us. So we experience it, and a lot of the experiences that you talked about are things that you didn't plan, but it happened to you, and once it happened to you, it stuck with you, especially the spiritual aspects of that mystery, what it was that you encountered and what it was that stayed with you years after the original experience. And that's one of the qualities, you might say, of spiritual realities. They don't diminish. They don't fade away. We may have to remind ourselves of them periodically, but they stay with us. They don't get old. Okay? And in our religion and in other religions, the kinds of mysteries that we celebrate, the spiritual realities that we celebrate, are the mysteries of goodness, or the good mysteries. I don't know of any religion that celebrates the bad things that happen to people, because we don't necessarily want to get reconnected with that. I mean, we're aware that they're there, either bad things that happen to other people or bad things that happen to us. I mean, things like hatred or jealousy or anger and so on. We usually want to get away from those things and get into more of the life-giving and life-affirming kinds of mysteries. So we've been talking about symbols in an experiential way and kind of leading into sacraments. I'm trying to get you to understand sacraments, you might say, from the inside out. If you understand how symbols work from the inside out, in terms of your experience, then as we get into sacraments, and we're going to do that in the second part, you'll say, well, that's what sacraments are, and that's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to work in the same way that symbols work. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So let's take a little break now for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for the second part of the program.
You have been watching one of the many offerings available through the Archdiocese of Louisville Ministry Institute. If you would like to register for a class or find out more about both taped and live offerings, you may contact Sal Delabella at 448-8581, or if you prefer, you may email at almi@archlou.org.
This Archdiocese Today is available on home video. To place your order, call 636-0296, extension 1230. The cost for either DVD or VHS is $14.95 plus $2 shipping and handling. Or you may email video@archlou.org.